Elixir is the language, Phoenix is the web framework, and then LiveView is kind of on top of Phoenix to leverage, to give you some interactivity that you don't necessarily usually get with an MVC server rendered framework. I'm Don Barlow. I use the pronouns he and him. I'm at Don Barlow on the Denver, Erlang, and Elixir Slack. So we have there's a generic Elixir Slack, but it's the free, so everything kind of rolls off. So we have a Denver and Elixir, Erlang Elixir Slack. So things stay on there a little bit longer, which is kind of nice. And then I'm out of bar on most things, GitHub, et cetera, et cetera. So like I said, we're kind of gonna briefly talk about a lot of these things, just to kind of give an overview. And then I'll have with Elixir, the language itself, Phoenix. And then once again, LiveView kind of builds on top of that. And then I have, like I said, just a small little demo app, just kind of like show as best I can the power of how all these things kind of come together. That it's not necessarily like one individual thing about this stack, but it's when you combine all these things, it makes for a very powerful programming environment for web applications. So Elixir is a dynamic functional language for building scalable and maintainable applications. Obviously, the keyword there being functional. For people that weren't here in the beginning, I did Ruby for a long time, 10, 12 years or so. And then we started to do Elixir as well. My current role, I do Elixir full time. So it took a little while for the recursion and list processing and stuff like that to kind of, really click and be a, first class thing in my head versus classes and methods and mutated state and things like that. So even if you're an OO programmer, even just learning Elixir, just for the pure functional part of it, rather than learning something like Haskell or something like that, is actually not a bad way to go as well. So what the power of Elixir is that it leverages the Erlang virtual machine underneath. Roland was kind of talking about this underneath the hood, is you have these really, really lightweight processes, also built to be distributed. It was created to run phone switches. So obviously phone switches are distributed as you want to take a phone call on the other side of the planet, and also fault tolerant. So like I'm on a phone call and my wife's on a phone call, something happens with mine, my call drops. Every call that goes through that switch shouldn't be dropped, but just that one, and maybe restart it or whatever, so I can retry to call that person back. So Elixir in general, it's used a lot for web development, but it's also used for embedded software, data ingestion, multimedia processing, a lot of different things. It's a generic, back-end language, but with LiveView, it kind of gives you like a full stack environment to work with. Okay, so Phoenix, it's a web framework written in Elixir. So it's similar to Rails or like Django in that it's a server-side MVC model view controller framework. However, because of the Erlang virtual machine, Phoenix can use WebSockets to provide real-time capabilities. So rather than having like a React app that kind of pulls back or hits back to either a REST and or GraphQL kind of API, you have that open web connection. So things can go from the browser to the server, and also, as we'll get into, from the server back down to the browser. So LiveView, like I said, it's this framework that's kind of built on top of Phoenix that provides rich real-time user experiences with server rendered HTML. So the server rendered part is really important. Once again, you're focused on the server, and that's where my business logic is. That's where, if I have a database, my data storage goes, and I can reason about it in more of like an old school Rails. They actually call it dead pages versus live pages. So you could focus on that. Over the last, obviously, for so long, we've had Vue and React and Angular and those kind of front-end frameworks that will kind of interact with a back-end application, whatever that happens to be. Sometimes that's Node, but sometimes that's Rails, or sometimes that's like Django or some other kind of back-end API. But then you have a distributed system, right? And you have, a lot of times too, you have different teams working on the front end versus working on the back end. And those different teams sometimes have different priorities. different, ways of working. So the coordination of that also adds some overhead. So LiveView kind of allows you to skip all that and goes back to when I first started doing Ruby on Rails. You can kind of focus on the server rendered HTML, think about it from the server side, and then LiveView, just it's the magic, or however, the underlying framework takes care of those updates for you of how the browser changes. So there's the popularity of LiveView has issued some clones out there. So Java has Medusa. I'm not familiar with any of these, except for PHP Livewire for a handful of reasons. Actually, a little bit on Stimulus Reflex. But they all have, Haskell is a functional language and more of a process kind of model. So that has a similar thing. But as we'll get into, the power behind LiveView is not just the language. The power is this Erlang virtual machine with this concurrent programming, easy concurrency, and Phoenix itself has PubSub built in. So when something happens, whether it be on the front end or on the back end, you can then broadcast that, and then anybody who's interested can subscribe to those messages and respond to them. Chris McCord, he's the creator of Phoenix and LiveView. He calls them live apps to kind of get away from like a SPA, a single page application, or from just a traditional server rendered application, like I said, old school kind of Ruby on Rails thing. So the big difference, like I said, is that there's this stateful live running application, this really lightweight process. So every LiveView, so every browser that connects has its own LiveView. So like if 1,000 people connect, there are 1,000 LiveView processes that all are running on that server. But since they're really lightweight and concurrent, and if they fail, you just start up a new one. And then the framework itself will say, hey, the connection dropped, and then it'll kind of pause, try to reconnect. And then eventually when it reconnects, you'll start out in the beginning state for that new application that starts running. So like I said, the power is that it can handle out-of-band updates. So like I said, a lot of what I did previously was process a lot of big files. So we had, dashboards for operations folks or for customers to kind of see the status of the processing of their data and whatnot. But you would always have to pull and say, hey, what's going on with this? And then, typically you would use Postgres as your kind of backend store. But now you can have these kind of connected distributed systems. And so as soon as something's updated, you can then broadcast that out. And then any running web application, any running LiveView can subscribe to that and then be notified of that and see those updates happen in a more real-time manner. It's not super real-time. Obviously, there is going to be some delay in anything, but it's without having to go a full separate application, a separate React app or whatever, you can get vast amounts of real-time interactivity just within the LiveView framework. So ElixirConf last year, Chris McCord has one of the keynotes. He called it the future of full stack. And here's what he said. LiveView changes the frontiers of what you can reasonably accomplish in an application. There's no complexity tax for making features real-time and dynamic. So whatever makes sense to be real-time or dynamic gets to be. No further thought required. So for instance, when I first started using LiveView, it was like what I normally would have done in a Rails app was have a drop-down list of, there's 200 or 300 options you could pick from. But it's kind of nice to be able to have an autocomplete that you can just, start typing some characters and it'll do a fuzzy search based on those values and pop up a few of them so I can select one. So normally you would have to use a JavaScript framework or some sort of jQuery plugin or something like that to kind of do some of that. You'd have to have a REST endpoint or some kind of GraphQL endpoint on the back end that would respond to those JavaScript requests. But with LiveView, even being very new to the framework, I was able to implement that. Really, it probably took me longer to kind of style how I wanted that drop down to be more than it did to actually just update the values on the page. It was really pretty straightforward. So then since it's so easy to do stuff like that, like, well, why not? Why not throw in some better interactivity for the user? Because it's not like this whole separate thing that's going to take me a few days to do. I can just do it in an afternoon or an hour or two. So Chris McCord has also made like a reference application. It's called LiveBeats. So it's kind of like a music sharing app. So I can play music and then like also see what other music other people are playing and listen in on what they're playing. You can sign in with a GitHub authentication, and I haven't really played around with it, but the code is open source. So you can kind of see like how, the creator of Phoenix and LiveView says, hey, this is probably a good way to structure your application or use its features. And they also kind of use it as like a test bed for like new features and stuff like that. So you have like a real world scenario to kind of talk about a community forum of like, hey, does this feature work for people or not as well? So I have this tiny little demo app. So a LiveView is what's called underneath the hood. It's a gen server, like I said. So it's a running process that has state. And so as I click on these different buttons, it changes the background. But as you can tell, there's no page refresh or anything like that. It just changes the color of this background. And how it does that is in the code. So here's the like template, if you will. In the code, I have this PH click event, and I call it change color. And then I pass in this value of color of raspberry in this specific case, right? In my LiveView, all I do is handle that event. So I'll get into this active color and assigns in a second as well. But essentially what it does is on the server side, it renders what changed. Or I'm sorry, on the server side, it like update its state. So everywhere in here, you'll kind of see socket. That's really just like the state. So like in particular, when you first start an application, you set its state or set its socket. So what I'm going to do, once again, I'll get into this other active color module. But the first thing I'm going to do is set the active color to whatever the currently active color is. I'll also get into the subscribe as well. But then I return, these are called tuples in Elixir. So I return this OK tuple with the socket that exists, so it has the state. So then as my state changes color, it will automatically just change this value, which in my template becomes very similar to Rails, becomes this active color variable. So it automatically does that binding. So as it changes, in this case, I'm using a little helper function. So this would be similar to Rails helpers, but you can put them, you can really, if you have shared ones, you can kind of put them anywhere. They're just, once again, since Elixir is a functional language, they're just functions. They just take in some data. There is no data mutation, and it returns out some data. So in this case, I pass in the active color, and then I just build what that color is. So they all kind of look like this. This is just some custom colors I have set up. So that's where the raspberry, indigo dye, these slate blue kind of colors come from. So this active color that I want to get into. So this is actually a gen server. I define what my starting color is just to put it somewhere, I guess. And then also, like I said, built into Phoenix is this pub sub framework. So it allows you obviously to subscribe to topics, and then whenever a message is broadcast to that, anybody who subscribed to that will get that message. So as part of, I don't want to get too much into this, but there's like a supervision tree. So like as processes, if something dies, that supervision tree handles like starting them back up. So that's what this start link is. So the Phoenix running, web application starts up, and then it also starts up this specific gen server as well. I start out that starting color of raspberry, and that gets passed in here as the state. And then this init callback is called, and I'm not doing anything but saying, yep, the state of what I started with is what I'm going to work on. So in my LiveView, when I change the color, so when I click on this light blue color, it will handle this change color event and then it calls this function assign active color. So I have an API that has this assign active color, which underneath the hood does a cast. So a cast in GenServer is I fire a message, but I don't care about a response, where a call is I fire off a message and I'm going to wait for that response. I'm going to block until I get that response back. So when I assign the color, I don't necessarily care about getting a response right away. Update it whenever you update it. And then the way this is set up is when it's updated, it's going to then broadcast to anybody who's subscribed. So here's where that, like I said, in the mount where I have this subscribe. So to talk briefly about this if connected, so how LiveView works, how its life cycle is it will render the static HTML, and then it renders everything else again to hold it in memory. So that second rendering, it calls mount again. And so you can say, hey, if it's connected, now I know this is code that only deals with that running LiveView process. So I don't care about subscribing to the active color on that first rendering, because that just fires up a process, does the rendering, and then dies. It's only that second rendering that's connected, that's now a live running process, that I want to subscribe to color updates. So I click on that slate blue, it says cast, hey, change the color to slate blue. I handle the way GenServers work, you have callbacks for everything. So I handle that cast, I set the state to the new color, and then I broadcast this color changed event with the color. And then cast do no reply. Actually, they have a couple of options you can return, but in generally, you're going to do a no reply. So that will just broadcast. Once again, just use the built-in phoenix.pubsub. I have that pubsub name and which topic it is. I have it just kind of hard-coded up here. In this case, I only have one, if you will, instance of this running GenServer. So I just use the module name as the topic name because there's only one of them running. And then I also supply a function for external customers, for instance, this LiveView page, to subscribe to anything on that topic. Like I said, in this case, I'm using the topic of this module name. So then in my LiveView, that's where this get active color comes from. So once that active color starts, it's assigned, like I said, raspberry to start as the LiveView. That's my initial state. And then if I want to get the active color, I'm going to call, like I said, once again, I want to wait for what that active color is before. So when that broadcast is there, when it says, hey, I changed that color to, in this case, slate blue, that's when I assign that to my state, my socket in this LiveView. And then I update the socket. And then that automatically just changes this variable, right? This active color, and changes the background color. There's some other things I have in here, like I make it bold if the active color happens to be, like in this case, raspberry or whatever, and then add this little, bar at the bottom as well, based on whether the active color is the one that's appropriate for this button. So really, and those are just kind of said, just handled with small little, dinky little helpers. And then, so then the power is now I have another browser. And I'll start off, and it, as you can see, it didn't start out with that raspberry state as what it color. It queried when this LiveView first started up. It says, hey, what's the active color? The active color is actually slate blue, right? So that's why it didn't start with that. And as I change it here, it's gonna as you can see, there's a delay. But for the most part, it's pretty real time and interactive. So anything that I do on anything, eventually ends up and shows up on the other pages. So I don't know why slate blue is not. Oh, there it goes. Once again, it's distributed, so eventually concurrent, just like any kind of distributed system is. But as you can tell, this makes it, you think about like in a chat application, it makes it really easy to broadcast updates, like what somebody said in a chat application or something like that. But just the power of PubSub with Phoenix and the Elixir or the Erlang virtual machine with this framework that just, as you can tell, just has a little bit of code to kind of connect all those things together is pretty powerful. You have a bibliography, you know, the YouTube has the ElixirConf video, the LiveBeats application, the GitHub for it's on here. And once again, we have monthly meetups for Denver, Erlang, and Elixir. We have, I don't know, 10, 20 people on a given, it's the first Monday of the month. It's a fairly active group. That's really all I have. Does anybody have any questions for anything else?